So, right, the past shapes the present. Second one, right, history gives meaning to imagined communities. So what I mean by this is every country, every group of people, right, has a history and a story they tell about that history. And in many cases, part of what's going on, right, is a contestation over competing histories of a people. We see this in pretty much every country today. You have competing narratives about who are the real people in that history. It ties in strongly as well to fascist politics. And finally, right, history can serve as a cautionary tale, both things that went well in the past and also things that went disastrous that we want to learn from so we don't repeat those mistakes, hopefully in the future. I want to start tonight with a bit of a story. Emma Goldman, famous Russian-born anarchist who was deported from the United States on the USS Buford in December 21st, 1919. This is what Goldman wrote afterwards once she was in Russia about this moment in US history. In a long corridor, dimly lit and unheated, we found the men deportees assembled, little Morris Becker among them. He had been delivered to the island, she's talking about Ellis Island, only that afternoon with a number of other Russian boys. One of them was on crutches, another suffering from an ulcerated stomach had been carried from his bed in the island hospital. They had been hurried out of their cells without being allowed even time to gather up all of their things. Routed from sleep at midnight, they were driven bag and baggage into the corridor. Some were still half asleep, unable to realize what was happening. I felt tired and cold. No chairs or benches were about. We stood shivering in the barn-like place. The suddenness of the attack took the men by surprise, and they filled the corridor with a hubbub of explanations and exclamations and questions and excited expostulations. Some had been promised a review of their cases. Others were waiting to be bailed out pending final decisions. And she's talking about the deportation cases that these individuals were facing. They'd received no notice of the nearness of their deportation, and they were overwhelmed by the midnight assault. They stood helplessly about, at a loss what to do. The men grasped desperately at the last hope and appointed him, one of the individuals in the group, a representative and spokesman. He succeeded in prevailing upon the island commissioner to permit the men to telegraph at their own expense to their friends in New York for money and necessities. Hardly had the last wire been sent when the corridor filled with state and federal detectives, officers of the Immigration Bureau, and Coast Guards. Deep snow lay on the ground. Air was cut by a biting wind. A row of armed civilians and soldiers stood along the road to the bank. Dimly, the outlines of a barge were visible through the morning mist. One by one, the deportees marched, flanked on each side by the uniformed men, curses and threats accompanying the thud of their feet on the frozen ground. When the last man had crossed the gangplank, the girls and I were ordered to follow, officers in front and in back of us. We were led to a cabin. A large fire roared in the iron stove, filling the air with heat and fumes. We felt suffocating. There was no air or water. Then came a violent lurch. We were on our way. I looked at my watch. It was 4:20 a.m. on the day of our Lord, December 21st, 1919. On the deck above us, I could hear the men tramping up and down in the wintry blast. I felt dizzy, visioning a transport of politicals doomed to Siberia, the etapas of former Russian days. Russia of the past rose before me, and I saw the revolutionary martyrs being driven into exile. But no, it was New York. It was America, the land of liberty. Through the porthole, I could see the great city receding into the distance, its skyline of buildings traceable by their rearing heads. It was my beloved city, the metropolis of the New World. It was America, indeed, America repeating the terrible scenes of Tsarist Russia. I glanced up, the Statue of Liberty. The USS Buford, which came to be called the Soviet Ark or the Red Ark, was part of a pinnacle of events that came to be known as the Red Scare in the United States. This is the first Red Scare, not the later McCarthy's era Red Scare of the 50s. This is a cartoon from an American newspaper. Folks can read it. It says, "Merry Christmas to Messrs. Lenin and Trotsky, Russia." And you can see the detainees locked up in a cage, getting ready to be loaded onto the ship. You can see edge of the Buford there in the background. I want us to think about that moment, the end of 1919, with this moment from just last month. Kristi Noem, head of the Department of Homeland Security, visiting the El Salvador detention facility where US detainees have been shipped, some of them illegally, potentially permanently, in a repeat of an anti-immigrant deportation mass hysteria. So for those of you that aren't familiar, there's debates about the exact time for the Red Scare. Some people limit it to 1919 to 1920, but really the trends that were going on, we need to go back a little bit earlier to 1917 and then to go forward a bit till 1921. The backdrop to a lot of this story is the 1917 Russian Revolution. The Bolsheviks come to power. 1919 was a year in the United States and in many other parts of the world where we saw massive labor strikes, massive militant organizing on the streets, and also growing racial unrest, particularly in the context of the United States. This led to essentially 2 years of the American public, American media, and the US government being gripped by an anti-immigrant mass hysteria. And also the beginning of an era of both government and legal repression that will have future waves. And you can see one of the cartoons here, right, specifically focused on the labor actions that were taking place. You start with strikes and walkouts, and then that becomes disorder, riots, Bolshevism and murder, chaos, and then what comes next. The headlines in 1919 and throughout into early 1920 were full of story after story after story of mass actions. Just to give you a context of a few key things, right? In November of 1915, Thanksgiving, the second refounding of the Ku Klux Klan happens, Stone Mountain in Georgia. Right? This is the beginning of the second wave of racial terror in the United States. That will play out in the following years in 1917 with East St. Louis massacre. The next year in 1917 with the conflict in Houston involving the all-black 24th Infantry Regiment. Between February and the fall of 1919, we have major mass strikes. Right? Seattle General Strike, one of the biggest mass strikes in US history, 60,000 workers come out in support of the shipyard workers. May 1, right, the longstanding international celebration of workers, May Day. You have a Boston police strike that causes a brief period of chaos in the Northeast. You have huge coal and steel strikes taking place with upwards of 500,000 laborers coming out, taking place in mass actions. And right, we had at the end of that in 1921, right, the infamous Tulsa race massacre. These are all things that are coming out at the same sort of moment in time and are creating a highly politicized moment in US politics where there are no people on the sidelines anymore. Everyone's getting pulled into the politics of this moment. Just to give you an idea, right, of what was going on in the US at this time, right, that purple line where it says 1919, 4.5 million workers across the United States are on strike in 1919. Right? Close to 4,000 individual separate labor actions taking place. Right? This will be the height of militancy in the labor unions, but will also be the height of the Red Scare and political repression as both the government and right, big industries push back against this renewed labor militancy. So what was the background that was taking place right, at this particular moment? There's a couple things that we need to keep in mind. Right? Immigration Act of 1903, originally dubbed the Anarchist Exclusion Act, begins to set the stage for what will become the Red Scare a little over a decade later. And specifically, that law set out 4 groups that would be forbidden to enter the United States. Right? Anarchists, beggars, epileptics, and anyone that was involved in importing prostitutes into the United States. And this is coming on the heels of the earlier kind of yellow peril, right, the Chinese exclusion politics, kind of anti-Asian sentiments, both in relation to Chinese and Japanese migrants coming in. 1914, World War I breaks out. through till 1918. In the height and end period of that war, in response to both militant anti-war organizing and draft resistance and anti-war agitation, we get a series of domestic laws trying to quell this political activity. In 1917, the Espionage Act, 1918, the Sedition Act. And then those laws, the government, at least some in the US government, feel like they're not strong enough. So we get a 1917 Immigration Act, variously referred to as the Literacy Act or the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, right? Specifically targeting Asian migrants coming in, trying to keep them out. Those laws are still seen as too narrow, not capturing enough of this growing radical dissent in the United States. So we get a revision to the Immigration Act in 1918, referred to as the Alien Anarchist Exclusion Act, which attempts to expand even further the definition of who can be deported by specifically saying if you're even a member of an organization, right? So if you're a member of the Communist Party, if you're a member of the IWW or the Russian Workers' Service or others, that alone could be grounds for deportation under these laws. And specifically this last one, the Immigration Act of 1918, will be the basis that will be used in the Palmer raids in 1919 and 1920 to start deporting people because of their political affiliations, even if they've technically not committed any crime under US law. Three important things happen in this period that will shape what's going on and that historians have spent a lot of time trying to think through and unpack. This is the moment in 1908, in the lead up to this growing political militancy, when we have the creation of the Bureau of Investigations. This is the precursor to what is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, right, the FBI. So this is sort of where the FBI first gets its origins. Inside of this Bureau of Investigations, so this is all under the Justice Department at the time, there's created a General Intelligence Division. And J. Edgar Hoover, who you'll know from the McCarthy era infamy, is appointed the first head to run that. And he'll run that from 1919 until 1924, when it formally merges into the FBI. One of the first things that Hoover does, remember, he'd worked at the Library of Congress, so he had a really good mind for how do we organize index data. So he creates a card index to start tracking every individual, radical, militant, red, Bolshevist, communist, and indexing who they're affiliated with, what groups they're a part of, what publications they subscribe to. Have they been arrested? Where? Who are their known associates? And in this process, already Hoover's got 150,000 individual cards of radicals that are being compiled as we're moving into this Palmer era. That index will then later get converted when he moves into the FBI into, it has about 9 different names, but commonly referred to as the Custodian Detention Index. And this will eventually explode throughout the 20s and into the 30s under Hoover's watch to over 10 million individuals, right? And these indexes still exist today. So this is really the beginning of mass government surveillance of political activists, whether they're leftists, labor activists, gender deviants, and many other categories, right? Anyone that was seen as a potential subversive at that time. Coming out of this same moment, right, we get 2 important sort of bodies that are created. The Overman Committee, named after the chair, Democrat from North Carolina, Lee Overman, and the Lusk Commission. Both of these are essentially created to look into and investigate subversive and radical activities, particularly Bolshevik activities in the aftermath of the 1917 Russian Revolution. And their goal are sort of 2 parts, right? One is to track German subversion as the war is going on. And then once the war ends, to track the growing threat of the Red Menace, as was often referred to at this time period. This agency will play a key role in helping to promote the raids that take place throughout the Palmer era, as well as taking place afterwards. The Lusk Commission, set up in New York State, becomes even more important as one of the key drivers mobilizing various patriotic citizens organizations, groups like the Pinkertons, the Bureau of Investigations, and others, going after anyone suspected of being a potential radical. They are under the sort of auspices of a joint committee in the New York legislature, but they're the ones that are using this criminal anarchy law in the New York Penal Code to go after political dissidents. And importantly, they also start targeting members of the Socialist Party. So there's two separate incidents in the 1921 period where you have members that are elected by New York citizens to the New York legislature on the Socialist Party ticket. And the majority of the state representatives, when they're supposed to come and sort of begin their term, pass resolutions rejecting them and not allowing them to sit. And this happens two different periods of time, despite the candidates winning popular majority votes in the local New York elections. There's a whole history around just the Lust Commission itself. You could do a whole sort of talk just on that itself. So the Palmer raids are really the kind of height of this anti-red era, right? 1919 to 1920, where we see mass political arrests, mass political targeting. If you're an anarchist, a socialist, a communist, a Bolshevik, an IWW, or maybe even just a pinko who's potentially sympathetic to, right, socialist equality issues. There's a couple key moments that highlight the sort of broad arc of the story of the Palmer raids. So beginning in June 12, 1919, you have the Russian Soviet Bureau raided in New York City, followed shortly after in June of the Rand School, which was set up as a place to be an educational institution, much like a university college, promoting, right, more left liberal political thought. November 7th, 1919, right, anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Union of Russian Workers Office is raided in New York City, where roughly 200 people are arrested. One of the important things about this is we know now from historical records that that date, November 7th, 1919, was actually chosen by the Bureau of Investigations and by A. Mitchell Palmer, who is the one whose name is sort of moniker, right? The Palmer raids are named after him in his role as Attorney General of the United States. They have an entire network of spies and agent provocateurs that have been slowly infiltrating into leftist organizations throughout 1916, 1917, 1918, 1919. And there's a memo sent out from Palmer to all the branch offices saying, we would like you to try to organize your local communist group or socialist group or Wobbly's group to have a members meeting on November 7th so that they're all in the same place. So when we conduct our nationwide raids, we have them already easier to round up. Right? No one knew this at the time, but we now know in hindsight from all of the FBI records, FOIA documents that have been released. The success of that bolsters both Palmer and the kind of anti-red politics that are going on. So Palmer says, all right, let's expand what we're doing. So December 21st, 1919, we get the first wave of deportations celebrated by Palmer and the US government to say, look, these raids are working, we're shipping these people off. And this is where Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, and a number of other individuals, right, are visibly and publicly sent off in kind of a big media show. J. Edgar Hoover himself comes down to Ellis Island to kind of watch the boat take off. Building on that success and the great publicity, they plan an even bigger action. So on January 2nd, 1920, they coordinate a series of mass raids in over 30 states across the United States. Netting numbers vary somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people in these mass coordinated raids at the same time. As this is going on, we're seeing, right, more anti-red, more anti-immigrant sentiment. We're seeing more calls for deportations. And importantly, we start to hear calls from elected officials, members of patriotic organizations, and others saying, hey, not only should we be deporting these radicals, we should consider revoking citizenship of domestic radicals and kicking them out as well. Right? So opening up a whole nother possible legal avenue for deporting, right, domestics. So you see, right, headlines throughout this period in 1919 as the raids are going on, raids here, right, raids on the Rand School, and you see lots of these photos where you have, right, all of the subversive documents that were seized from these raids, and you have these big stage scenes of people being arrested at these coordinated, right, Bureau of Investigation actions. At the same time, people are starting to get a little bit worried. People that have no criminal records are getting rounded up in these arrests. people are being deported whose only crime is to be a member of one of these subversive organizations. Some of them literally, they joined without having any idea what the real mission was. It was what all their friends were doing, particularly for Russian immigrants, Eastern European immigrants, some of them who have very little English language when they're first coming over. For them, it's just a social club, effectively. But from the government's perspective, right, they're too closely affiliated with the Bolsheviks to let them kind of go. This is where another key figure in the story. So we've got Palmer on one side, kind of driving and pushing these politics. We've got Louis F. Post on the other, Assistant Secretary of Labor. At this time, right, the Bureau of Immigration falls under the Bureau of Labor. So they're the ones that are sort of hearing deportation cases and making decisions on these arrests. He's much more sympathetic to folks that are being deported because he's worried that there's just widespread violations of the law taking place. So just as an example, there were roughly 5,000 warrants that were issued to the Bureau of Investigation between 1919 and 1920 in this period, and about 3,000 arrests made by either Bureau of Immigration agents or folks working for them. Of those, roughly 2,200 were not served by agents either because they couldn't find people, they had the wrong names. You know, as sometimes happened with warrants, it turns out to be garbage. But 3,000 of those warrants were thrown out by Post for effectively not having any real substance and no evidence to justify that warrant. And out of all of these cases, only about 600 individuals are actually deported in this period. So between March 6th and April 10th, Post writes in a book that he published in 1923 talking about his experience in this role. And he said there were about 1,600 red cases that came before him in his official capacity to review the deportation and rule, is this a valid deportation and should be executed, or was it found under false premises and these individuals should be released? And he finds 1,140 of those warrants were canceled by him because there was no real evidence to support the warrant that was initially issued. So only about 460 individuals out of all these cases he gets, he says, these are actually legitimate cases that have evidence to support them. He's seen by Palmer and others in the US government as too sympathetic to the Reds. And so by the fall of 1920, Congress is having discussions about should we have impeachment hearings to impeach him because he's obstructing this deportation process. But we're already starting to see the kind of backlash to Palmer and the raids taking place. So in summer, May of 1920, the National Popular Government League, which was made up of a series of sort of civic leaders, scholars, legal experts, releases this report to the American people upon the illegal practices of the United States Department of Justice. And what they argue is essentially the raids that have been happening over the last year and a half are cruel and unusual punishment for those that have been caught up in this net. Many of these arrests have actually taken place without warrants. Sometimes people are arrested and then the Bureau of Investigations applies for a warrant after the fact, says, oh, now we have the proof, right, that we needed initially that we didn't have. They argue there's unreasonable search and seizures. They argue that agents are acting very provocative, right, in terms of how they're interacting with people when they're raiding these businesses. They're worried that people are being compelled to basically testify, yes, I am this radical you claim, or yes, I've been involved in these criminal activities, so that they can then meet the criteria for deportation. And most importantly, they argue that there's a widespread propaganda campaign being funded, coordinated, and organized by the Department of Justice and by Palmer to stoke this anti-red political sentiment and to justify these deportations. So by the beginning of 1921, we're now starting to see public backlash. Liberal newspapers, some conservative newspapers, even some conservative politicians who had initially supported all these raids are worried that things are getting too out of control. So as the Red Scare starts to recede in 1921, we still see this kind of broader kind of nativist America First politics going on. So even as people are kind of reeling back from, they're realizing this claim that there's going to be a Bolshevik revolution that's going to topple the US government is largely nonsense. There was never enough numerical support in the United States for a communist or a Bolshevik revolution. And even at the height of the Red Scare, if the entire left, mobilized, they could not topple the United States government. But the rhetoric of the threat they posed was enough to whip up the masses. But it's exactly at this moment, as the Red Scare is starting to kind of roll back in its political and legislative frames, that we start to see a kind of second wave of pushes for loyalty oaths for teachers. We start to see purges of books in schools. We start to see history texts rewritten, and kind of another wave of political censorship in a different sort of register. So just briefly, for those of you that are interested in this history, right, this is, I haven't even sort of scratched the surface yet on this story. Louis F. Post, the Assistant Secretary of Labor at the time, wrote this really fascinating book a few years later called The Deportation Delirium of 1920. If you're interested in getting sort of an inside perspective of someone who is looking at these cases, hearing these cases, looking at the evidence, it's an excellent document. The other two are Red Scare, A Study in National Hysteria, 1919-1920 by Robert K. Murray. And then just 2 years ago, Adam Hochschild's book, American Midnight, that looks at this period in relationship to the war, in relationship to labor and leftist politics, and in relationship to the precursors of the civil rights movement and the kind of racial strife that's taking place in this time period. So if folks are interested in this history, these are a few things that I would encourage people to look at. Okay, so why did I talk about all that history? I want to situate it in what's going on right now so that we can think about those connections. How many folks are familiar with Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia? Okay, so he's a 29-year-old individual who was caught up in these most recent deportation arrests that the US government claims he's a member of Tren de Aragua, part of these El Salvadoran gangs. He was sent down to El Salvador to the prison, only for us recently to find out that in fact he was sent there because of administrative error. And the evidence that the US government has presented to prove that he's a gang member is essentially that he was wearing a Chicago Bulls hoodie and that he was a member of a group in Western New York, even though he'd never lived in Western New York. This is what the US government lawyers said about why we can't bring him back and why essentially it's too bad. The US concedes that the removal to El Salvador was an administrative error, but that does not license district courts to seize control over foreign relations, treat the executive branch as a subordinate diplomat, and demand that the US let a member of a foreign terrorist organization into America tonight. This is after the Maryland Federal District Court Judge, Polishinis, told the federal government, you must bring him back immediately. Just this afternoon, US Supreme Court Judge John Roberts issued an administrative stay when this was taken to the Supreme Court, saying, we need time to review this. We're not going to force the US government to bring him back right now. He's going to stay in the El Salvadoran prison, and we're going to have the Supreme Court decide what's going to happen next. These are precisely the same trends that we saw happen in 1919 and 1920, right? Individuals getting rounded up in this mass hysteria. In 1920s, right, it was the communists and the Reds. Right now, it's Latin American gangs, the new sort of red menace, if you will. Why does this matter? Protect Democracy, a group here in the United States that looks at political, civil rights, and liberties issues, has warned to pay attention to 7 signs that a country is moving increasingly away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. Independent institutions being politicized, spread of disinformation, executive power becoming more and more broad and unchecked, connected to a weakening of checks and balances on that power, quashing criticism and dissent, scapegoating vulnerable communities, corrupting elections, and stoking violence. These are 7 things they say, regardless of what country you're talking about, these are trends we need to pay attention to. Okay, so what does this have to do with fascism? So Roger Griffin, one of the kind of leading scholars on comparative fascism today, British scholar, argues that fascism is a political ideology. Its mythic core and its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. It's a mouthful. What the heck is palingenetic ultranationalism? It's a fancy way to say the idea of a mythic rebirth of the nation, right? Palin and Genesis, a new birth. He gives us a little more I think, usable definition. And he says, fascism is a revolutionary form of extreme illiberalism, often overtly racist. It's a nationalism which aims to bring about the total rebirth of a nation state, an ethnic nation, or an entire race, and at least historically, that's been a white race. We're seeing these same dynamics play out today, I would argue. One of the things that Protect Democracy put out last year and is updated this year is their authoritarian playbook. And they argue that as a country moves towards authoritarianism, there's certain things we want to really pay attention to, right? Pardoning of license, lawbreaking, investigating against critics and rivals, overreach of federal law enforcement, deployment of domestic military, and refusal of elected officers, particularly executives, to leave office. I would argue we've seen all these happen in the last 2 years. January 6th, insurrectionists. Effectively, all of them were pardoned, as well as a number of other individuals with questionable or criminal charges. We're seeing already investigations of critics of the current administration. We've seen a whole broad range of regulatory retaliations taking place, from targeting law firms, targeting individual officers in law firms, targeting media companies and others. We've certainly, I think people would argue, in the last month or two have seen overreach of the federal government in these current deportation raids that are taking place. Domestic deployment of military. We haven't seen a kind of martial law deployment, but we do have troops at the southern border right now. Active military troops there guarding the southern border. And we have a president who's talking about a third term, even though constitutionally that is not possible right now. So if we think about what was going on in the kind of zeitgeist of 1919 and 1920 and compare that to today, we're seeing a kind of a renewal of the America First kind of anti-globalism, which is in the United States, America First. But in Europe and other parts of the world, it's a right-wing nationalism, a national populism. Those of you that have been following elections last year, 2024 was the biggest year for elections in democracies. Overwhelmingly, countries moved to the right as populist and nationalist parties and far-right parties won elections. Germany to France to Austria to Sweden, many other places. In the United States, specifically, the kind of political ideology that we're seeing dominating political discourse, driving cultural politics, is a form of sort of white Christian nationalism, a very narrow identitarian politics rooted in a very specific, and most Christians would argue, distorted reading of Christian texts. We're also seeing broad attacks on the queer community, on LGBTQ rights, on trans students, on trans individuals. We're seeing attacks on women, women's rights, reproductive rights, attacks on multicultural democracy, attacks on education. Those of you that have been following Ohio politics, the recent Senate Bill 1 that was just passed is the best example of kind of an anti-education, educational policy, but this is a national trend right now. We've been seeing library and book bans taking place since at least 2020 across the country. And just recently with these DEI executive orders, we're seeing federal government websites purged of diverse individuals. The most recent one, the National Park Service, essentially taking down the actual history of the Underground Railroad and replacing it with a sanitized, apolitical version of US history and sort of Black radicalism. So if we think about, are we moving towards fascism today? Are we in a fascist state now? What is the dangers of fascism? So scholars like Barbara Walters would argue that we are an anocracy today. So if you imagine on one side, you have a strong, robust democracy. On the other side, you have a very restrictive, narrow, sort of autocratic politics. In the middle between those two is what political scientists refer to as anocracy. There are countries that have some aspects of democracy, but also some aspects of autocracy. 2021, the US moved into this anocracy range for the first time. We moved back out after 2021, but most scholars argue now we've slid way back down close to the 0 mark on that scale, meaning the United States is moving dangerously close to moving into the range of autocracy as political scientists measure the strength of democracy. Other scholars like Daniel Levitsky and others have argued we're actually moving into a kind of competitive authoritarianism. Not fascism, not a dictatorship, but a place where individual parties, political leaders increasingly dominate state, local, national politics, legislative, judicial, and executive branches at the state and also at the national level. Some scholars, right, we've had 3 key scholars of authoritarianism and civil wars just leave the United States in the last month because they're afraid of these political trends. Right, Griffin and other scholars of fascism say we're not that far down that road yet, and some of those worries are exaggerated, but the trends that they point to, right, are deeply worrying. So the message I would leave people with is we're not in a fascist state in the United States. We're not moving towards fascism yet. I would say we're moving towards competitive authoritarianism. But the things we need to watch out for are precisely the things that were happening in 1919 and 1920, and particularly the targeting and deportation and, right, gross violations of civil rights. So Protect Democracy gives us 10 steps, 10 things we can do, right, to try to prevent the slide into a potential, right, fascist, autocratic, authoritarian politics. Right? Create strong pro-democracy coalitions to push back, right, against these trends. That's the first one. Second one, right, is to take anti-democratic promises seriously. Right? When people say we don't care about the rule of law, we don't care if you violate your rights, if it serves our political purpose, believe them, take them at their word. Right? Don't say, oh, it's just rhetoric. Right? 3, right, keep a broad movement united around an accurate big picture. Right? So don't get lost in the weeds of every little new thing that's happening. Look at the bigger trends and where those trends are moving us. Right? 4th, right, support Republicans that stand firm in democratic institutions. Right? Because of the specific political moment in the United States and the power of the Democratic Party in Congress and in other branches of government, right, they have to be partners in pushing back for democratic reforms. And number 5, rally around, right, nonpartisan, independent public servants. Right? Promote people who stand up for the rule of law and doing their job rather than being partisan advocates for, right, one party or the other. And number 6, uphold the rule of law and institutions and always repudiate violence. Right, number 7, protect the first targets and arrange to advocate for the most vulnerable. Right, this is particularly relevant in the context of both the 1919-1920 Red Scare deportations, as well, right, as what's happening today with anti-immigrant deportation efforts under the Department of Homeland Security. Right, number 8, evaluate the security at a community level, at your household level, and at your own personal level. Right? Where can you engage safely? Where is it, right, potentially dangerous, particularly those that are here on student visas, here as, right, naturalized citizens, anyone who could potentially, right, risk falling, right, astray of these changing laws and regimes. Number 9, right, work to protect free and fair elections in the midterms in 2026 and in the next general election in 2028. And then finally, number 10, right, continue to build a democracy for tomorrow. Now, as I said, I would put 2 caveats on here. We need to keep creating pro-democracy institutions, but we're already in the crisis. So we don't have time to organize before the crisis. We have to do it while we're in the crisis moment. And the second one is that number 6, this is just my own personal belief, but armed self-defense is always justified. We don't promote violence, but if you have to defend yourselves when armed militias come for you, that I think is justified. I'll leave you with this final thought from a slightly later period, right, World War II. Martin Niemöller, German theologian and Lutheran pastor. For those of you that can read German, had the original there on the left. For those of you that don't, including myself, it's famous. It's not really a poem, but it's become sort of an informal poem. Right? He says, when the Nazis came for the communists, I kept quiet. I wasn't a communist. When they came for the trade unionists, I kept quiet. I wasn't a trade unionist. When they locked up the Social Democrats, I kept quiet. I wasn't a Social Democrat. When they locked up the Jews, I kept quiet. I wasn't a Jew. When they came for me, there was no one left to protest. So what we want to do is make sure we don't find ourselves in that situation again. Thank you.
So, questions? We have about 15 minutes. ask questions.
Sorry, I sort of crammed two talks into one there. Yeah, well,
Can you go back a few slides back to the strategies of here? So for the first one, I know you mentioned the crisis already here, but could you be able to expand on what exactly a pro-democracy coalition might entail, and like what avenues it might take? You know, like maybe before the crisis gets there. I know you already said crisis. What does that? What does that mean?
so it can mean, I think it would mean different things at different levels. So let's say at the very kind of simple level, the local level, right? It means building stronger community ties so that your neighbors are actually your neighbors again, rather than people that you don't talk to because they're political enemies, right? So that very kind of interpersonal level of getting away from the right, us versus them kind of polarizing rhetoric and moving more towards trying to look for, right, where is our common ground? In a more kind of organized political sense, it means, right, we need to be running candidates to contest school board elections, state level, county level. We need to be running candidates for Senate, for Congress, for right, Secretary of State, for governor, for mayor. Individuals who are committed to right, not even just bipartisan politics, because that locks us already into the Republican Democrat politics, right? But people that are committed to multicultural democracy, to right, a democracy accountable to the community, and a democracy that says we want sort of a big tent where everybody can be included and put right working folks, people of color, immigrants, poor white collar workers, blue collar workers, all in a common program that we all benefit from. Right? Because if we look at the United States right now, right, we're in a class war. There's no way to get away from that. And the 99%, to use kind of the old Wall Street lingo, right, we have much more in common with each other than we do with a very small group of political elite, but their money and influence is dominating politics at every sort of level. So if we want to build a strong, robust democracy, we need to be able to push back against those dynamics by both right, bringing more people into the community that we identify with, using that community as a basis to organize for political power, but then also I think thinking deeply about how did we get to this moment of political polarization and how do we start to walk back from it? Because particularly for those folks that are a little bit older in the audience, right, think about how much public discourse has shifted between the 1970s to today. I've seen it shift massively just from the 1980s to today, and particularly from the 1990s. Right? So how do we bring back a more sort of civic dialogue, a more civil dialogue? And also right, a commitment to right, an inclusive kind of democracy. So those are a couple, there's a lot more that we can obviously talk about that. I don't know if that helps at all.
Thank you.
I sometimes think that there's this rise to fascism because countries struggle maybe with the desire or strengthening like a nationalistic identity. Do you think that nationalism can exist independent of fascism?
Yeah, it definitely can. Because we've got examples of religious nationalism, secular nationalism, and sort of nationalism morphing into fascism or Nazism or other kind of forms. The danger is, I think, when patriotism morphs into nationalism, and particularly a kind of narrow ethno-national sort of politics, a kind of identitarian politics. So I think, personally for me, I see nationalism inherently as a problematic concept because it's based on a us and them, you're citizens and you're not. And I understand why that appeals to people, but I think there's a way to promote a kind of patriotism, love for country that doesn't require that sort of nationalism of exclusion at the same time.
There's a question from the online audience from Scott Smithson. Exceptional presentation. How can colleges and universities build in resilience and resistance to these changes, given that we are already seeing controls and influence by the federal government on higher education?
Great question, Scott. So I would say a couple of things. One, we need sort of institutionally, so whether you're at a private school like Denison or public universities like OSU or OU, we need to be pushing back, right, against both state legislation and federal policy. One of the biggest concerns that a lot of scholars of fascism talk about is this kind of anticipatory compliance, right? And we've seen this at Denison and other schools where you essentially do everything you think to get your ducks in a row so that you're not going to run afoul of anyone, whether it's the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Office within the Department of Education, or the Secretary of State, or whoever it might be. so that you don't have your state or federal funding stripped, or you don't have a lawsuit investigating you as we're worried about with private schools after that Dear Colleagues letter that was sent out last 2 months ago, I think now, back in February. So I think we need to, both institutionally as well as the folks in the institution, so the voice of the university as well as students, faculty, and staff, need to push back and say, no, these are our values, these are the things that drive our mission, and we're not willing to compromise on those. We're not willing, for example, to close our DE offices. We're not willing to cut courses off of our catalog because they don't fit a certain sort of thought policing that's coming out of state or national levels. But I think that only gets us so far, because institutions like Denison, we don't rely much on federal funding, so it's not a worry in that regard. For contests like those, I think we need to be strategizing about what is it about higher education today that has gotten the political right so kind of in a tizzy, in a culture war, the kind of woke war politics, anti-DEI, anti-CRT, that has promoted this idea that universities are a bastion of liberal thought and indoctrination. There's no space for diversity of thought, conservative voices or others aren't welcome and aren't open. How do we take those concerns seriously and expand those conversations? Because I think most people would agree. I mean, I grew up in a Republican family. Most of my immediate family and others are Republicans. The Republicanism of my mom and dad of the 80s is wildly different than the MAGA Republicanism of 2025. And those Republicans have been either purged from the party or pushed so far to the margins that their voice, their opinions, their priorities often no longer have a space. So how do we bring those voices back into the conversations? Because I think that's one of the places where universities can both bring people in and push back some of these narratives. I think the third thing that we need to be doing, universities are not doing a good job of convincing the public that we have a value today. So much of the discourse that we've heard over the last couple of years is that universities are increasingly irrelevant, they're increasingly elitist, that education has no longer become something that provides for a good training for future citizens, but is now just a place where people go to get indoctrinated. How do we take those critiques seriously, show where they're wrong, which I think is in most cases, but also address where are there places where we're not doing enough in our public K through 12 or in higher universities to bring those broad conversations in? And how do we address those in ways that don't undermine the very institutions where we need to keep the critical thought going? So how do we protect and push the value of critical thinking, of critical inquiry, of broadly speaking, kind of liberal values, without falling into the trap of getting into a reactionary backstep? Those are a few things that come to mind from that question. Either one.
Do you have anything to say in terms of what we can do to, I guess, mediate political empathy for some people who have been educated and do know what is going on, but either because they're overwhelmed with the situation or they just become disconnected from the political sphere, don't have the drive to do anything about it?
I mean, going back to the very beginning, Emma Goldman, she famously said, if I can't dance, this isn't my revolution. Paraphrasing, not her exact quote. We need to make community and political organizing and protection and defense of democracy something that communities want to come together and do because it's fun and it works. People continue to be involved in things because they feel a sense of belonging, and often, particularly if we're thinking about the broad context of civic engagement, or community involvement, people get involved in their community because A, they feel like they belong to that community, and B, they want to give something back to that community. And in giving to that community and getting something back, that creates a deeper, sort of more intricate web of interconnectivity, This is how imagined communities get created. So we need to think more creatively about not just how we resist, but how we go about organizing conversations about politics more broadly. I mean, my experience from the last 15 years of teaching a lot of political science courses is your average first-year student thinks about politics as bad, as negative, as something they want to avoid, something they were told not to ever talk about around the kitchen table growing up, and something that they're only studying unless they're, really into PPA or PPE or poli-sci. Right? It's something they're only taking because they're being required to, not because they feel like it has some meaning to their day-to-day lives. So I think we have to really help people see the kind of, this goes back to, right, second wave feminism and the idea of everyday politics, right? Personal is political. We need to re-engage people in that sense of, I can be engaged politically in ways that I might not overtly think are political, but still contribute to my community, build a stronger community, and make me want to stay engaged. Right? So that doing something doesn't mean, oh, I've got to cut these 3 hours out of my time, and I'm already short for time, and I'm already tired. I don't know if I can do that. But rather it becomes, hey, I'm looking forward to going to the same with these people and doing this because I get something out of it, and I feel like it's actually valuable to my community. And so if we can find ways to do that at local, regional, national, international levels, then politics takes on a kind of different resonance. So it's not always easy to do, but I think that's the kind of direction we need to move.
Do you think that mass protest movements like the hands-off protests on Saturday are effective at fighting against fascism, or do you think that our effort needs to be put into other means?
I definitely think they are. As someone who studies social movements in history, right, at almost every moment in world history, regardless of what country we're talking about, political change either happens through violent revolution or through large-scale nonviolent public mobilizations, right? More often than not, through large-scale public mobilizations. The trick is, right, when you need to hit that criteria, right? So scholars often argue the threshold roughly, if you can get 3% of your population on the streets, that's often enough to create political change, right? So the question is, how do you get that 3% or 5% mobilized in a way to actually create change, right? So we think about all the major movements in the United States, whether it's abolition, whether it's women's rights, whether it's suffrage, whether it's civil rights, whether it's the gay rights movement, whether it's environmental movements, whatever it is, all of those came about because of broad scale public support combined with engaging through legislation and boots on the ground, so to speak, right? People out on the street saying, this is what we want. So I think without that, you lose a key mechanism of leverage on political sort of actors, whether it's the state or sort of other forces. So yeah, I think they always matter. The question is, how do we get more people out onto the streets, right? Particularly in key moments of current or other historical periods. Yeah.
Does economic inequality and economic marginalization contribute to the rise of fascism?
It definitely does. Think about in the case of Germany in World War II, right, the kind of punitive state that Germany was left in after the Treaty of Versailles, and the kind of resentment and not apathy, the kind of resentment and anger that generated amongst the German public, right, that we were betrayed, which then turns against the internal enemies and then against the external enemies. That was heavily driven by economic issues, certainly not only economic issues. The interesting thing is that scholars in the last decade or two, what they found is that when countries start to move into sort of greater political polarization, greater factionalization, and even into kind of civil wars, students of mine that have been in my class, we've been talking about this, or we talked about this in past classes. It's actually not economic inequality that's the most likely reason that people become more politically polarized and involved in radicalization. It's actually the group that had historically the most power in society. They were kind of the best off, and their position is sliding, being downgraded, as scholars call it. And so they actually feel like they need to hang on to the power that they once had because they're being replaced, right? This is where we get contemporary kind of great replacement and white genocide sort of discourses. And that resentment is not being driven by poor on the margins of society, but actually by those most off, most well off economically and politically, who feel like their position is slowly decreasing and they want to push back on that. So in the context of the United States, globalization starting in the 1990s forward, those of you that grew up in the Midwest, Ohio used to be a heart of steel and coal and manufacturing, particularly along the Great Lakes, Youngstown all the way over Cleveland, Toledo. That all died, and we had a Rust Belt emerge as NAFTA, free trade agreements, ship jobs overseas for the benefits, right, of the American consumer and others. But the trade-off was, right, we destroyed much of the economic base of white middle-class labor unions, and it's those very communities now that are the most, right, sort of nationalistic in the sort of America First moment today. So it's not that they're there because they're poor, but rather the conditions that have made them feel like their position in society is sliding further and further away. So the economics certainly matter, but at least what scholars have been finding from sort of big comparative data sets is that it's the polarization, and particularly the kind of identity politics polarization, that's even more worrying, sliding into not just fascism, but sort of authoritarianism more sort of broadly.
After this next 4 years of labor, how long do you think it will take America to recover?
Good question. I think a lot of that will depend on how much existing institutions are deconstructed or completely destroyed over the next year, or technically the next 4 years, but I think a lot of that's going to happen in this year. So some of that may take years to rebuild some of those institutions. Others, we may see a bounce back or maybe even a pushback. We're already starting to see this in some really strong Republican districts where they're saying, you want to cut Medicaid? You want to cut what? Right? We're seeing things that people thought were safe, right? Were off the table, but are impacting them, right? Grocery prices going up, right? Those of you that follow, right, financial forecasts, right? We've seen huge losses in the Dow and the S&P, basically every financial index, right, over the last week because of the uncertainty around tariffs. Right? So as these kind of things start to cause more uncertainty and more political and economic chaos, I think we might see kind of a pushback in the way we saw in 1920, 1921 against the kind of Paul Murray excesses. People say, wait a minute, this isn't actually what I signed up for. This isn't the policies, the programs that I wanted. I like the rhetoric, but I don't like the sort of impact. That might forestall some of the sort of deconstructing of institutions. But when that pushback happens is the important point, because if it's December 2025 or December 2028, it's going to make a big difference. So unfortunately, if I had my magic 8-ball, I would ask it and see if it could give me a better answer.
Right, we're up to the time that we usually end, so I guess we'll have to leave it there. So thank you very much once again.